welcome all to this first webinar of seminar series entitled The Agri-Food Industry in the Wake of COVID-19, Countering the Exploitation of Migrant Workers in Italy and the US, or better, in the US and in Italy, for a matter of order. I think it has been a common experience to all of us to witness the fact that the pandemic exacerbated pre-existing and long-standing problems that were already there in the agricultural and food industry, problems that sat at the crossroads between organized crime, corruption, and trafficking of human beings, and more specifically, exploitation of workers in the fields. My name is Sara Pennicino. I teach international human rights in the Bologna campus of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I am very, very honored to present this cross-campus initiative between Washington and Bologna. Very exciting, challenging on the one hand because of the COVID challenge and because of putting together two different continents with an ocean in the middle. But I am very proud, and I am convinced that big challenges actually prepare for big results. Therefore, before moving to, let's say, a more fun introduction, which was that of the documentary to be introduced in a couple of seconds, I wanted to spend a few words to illustrate the concept which is behind the seminar series. Tonight, we will specifically focus on the business and human rights in the agri-food industry, and specifically, again, the case of migrant workers, but the series more in general tackles problems and situations that are of, let's say, common knowledge in our daily life. In Italy, the caporalato phenomenon, this is how it's called, represents a form of illegal intermediation and exploitation of migrant workers in the agricultural sector, constituting up to 1/4 of the total amount of the whole workforce. In the US, it is an open secret that those harvesting America's food are mainly migrants and decades-long residents of the country. Due to the pandemic, short-term flexible labor in the agri-food industry became in high demand, and it brought the problem of guaranteeing the supply chain to the attention of the general public. For this very reason, when friend and colleague Nina Gardner reached out from Washington to talk to me about this extremely interesting documentary that had just been released by Doha Debates, despite being directed by two Italian young directors and called The Invisibles, which offered a testimony of the, again, caporalato phenomenon, but more in general, the exploitation of migrant workers in Italian fields in agriculture, I was extremely enthusiastic about the idea of organizing a joint initiative that could offer our community an opportunity to enhance our knowledge of the legal, business, and more in general, the human aspects, the problematic aspects of this phenomenon. Tonight's seminar would have not been possible without the great help of all the interns from the CCSTD and especially all the International Law Society based in Washington. I want to thank especially all the, what used to be called the iLaw program, and all the people that are involved in the iLaw program, and again, the students in Washington and the students in Bologna. So a special thanks to all the people that were involved, a special thanks to Alexandra Malangone for being the person that coordinates the CCSTD project on human trafficking. We thought, together with Nina, that a good way to introduce the topic of our series was that of sharing a trailer of this documentary entitled The Invisibles, which was, again, as I said, produced by Doha Debates, that kindly gave us the opportunity to screen it here. And again, I invite you to look for the longer version online, but we thought that showing you the trailer could be a good way to grasp the very core of the problem, which is under discussion tonight, and that we will try to debate together with our two experts. I am not going to introduce the speakers because I'm going to leave that to our moderator, which is Nina Gardner, but I just want to express my deep, deep gratitude to both Honorable Judge Espinoza and to Yvan Sagnet for joining us tonight and for taking part to this debate that we believe is going to be rich and interesting. I would like to share one last information before leaving the floor to Nina and the panel. The next webinar, which is part of this series that I just described, is going to be held on December the 14th. The next seminar will focus on domestic policies regarding the legalization of undocumented workers, especially in the context of the agri-food industry and specifically in agriculture, both in the US and in Italy in the wake of COVID-19. I would therefore like to leave you with this short trailer of the documentary The Invisibles, and then I am going to leave the floor to Nina Gardner. And again, thank you all for being with us tonight.
Stiamo andando nell'insediamento dei braccianti di Borgo Mezzanone. I braccianti vivono in queste condizioni. Ti pagano 4 euro all'ora, 3 ore e mezza all'ora, senza i contratti, senza i loro diritti. Siamo alla tendopoli, i braccianti vogliono lavoro. Siamo dei braccianti invisibili, dannati della terra, abbandonati tra miseria sociale e lavorativa. Qui non c'è distanziamento sociale. Il distanziamento sociale è un privilegio, c'è promiscuità, non c'è accesso alle cure mediche, non c'è accesso alle strutture sanitarie dello Stato. Io da questa miseria ci sono nato. Ci sono nato in quanto bracciante e mi ci sono ritrovato nell'angolo dello sfruttamento. E per uscire dall'angolo mi sono detto non se ne viene fuori da solo. Sciopero! Bisogna condividere un sentimento che abbia al centro la riconquista del diritto di essere un essere umano, prima di essere un bracciante, perché io non sono una merce.
Okay, that was already, just the trailer is extremely moving. My name is Nina Gardner. I teach corporate sustainability, business and human rights at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, DC. And I want to salute and name the 2 Italian filmmakers, women, living in Washington, DC, who actually prepared this documentary. They are Diana Ferrero and Carola Mamberto, and I really hope that we'll be able to welcome them for a full discussion of the role of advocacy and the full documentary at a later date. But I just wanted to say how emozionata, I'll say it in Italian. It's just a very moving to be here among all of you. And I just wanted to say that for those of you who are in the US, we're on the eve of an important holiday, which is Thanksgiving. And this is a holiday in which we celebrate the first harvest of the Pilgrims with the Native Americans, which the focus is around food, the harvest, and family. And we're today really focused on showing what kind of family we are, shared humanity. And we will do a deep dive on where our food comes from, not only from an environmental point of view, because we all are focused on that. You know, is it organic? Does it have palm oil? Does it use a lot of water? But from a human rights and labor point of view, which we don't think about as much when we go to the supermarket. We are obsessed by food safety, but we should be equally obsessed by making sure that the people picking our food are treated with dignity and respect and live themselves in decent conditions. Ironically, it took a pandemic like COVID to focus our attention on who these essential workers are in our various supply chains. So it's not only the very brave, critical healthcare workers and others, but our ag workers as well, delivering nutritious food to our tables while we were all in lockdown. So it's in this light that I'm honored to be moderating this webinar. This is an issue that requires immediate attention from governments, consumers, and yet the private sector, as this is a business and human rights issue. And a few words about business and human rights as a field in the internationally recognized standard being used for such cases, which are the UN guiding principles for business and human rights, passed unanimously by the Human Rights Council in 2011, which is called the UNGPs. And these principles not only reiterated what is understood as the underpinning of international human rights law, which is that the duty of nation states is to protect the human rights of the individuals living in their territory. And we're seeing, you know, the movie just saw that, right? But also laid out the responsibilities of business in respecting human rights in their supply chains by avoiding the adverse impacts and writing what and preventing and mitigating adverse impacts when they are found. So later in the Q&A, we'll get into what government, business, and consumers can do to address these horrific exploitation of workers in the ag sector. But without further ado, I absolutely want to introduce, I'm delighted to introduce these two extraordinary speakers. And I'll start with Yvan Sagnet, a Cameroonian activist, we can call you that, right? And writer, known for founding the charity NoCap and his work against the exploitation of workers in the Italian ag industry. Yvan arrived in Italy in 2007 to attend the Polytechnic Institute in Turin to study engineering with a scholarship, right? And these things happen. You failed an exam and you lost your scholarship and you ended up going to Puglia in southern Italy to work at the Masseria Boncuri, a local farm, as a tomato picker. There, it took not much time to understand that the situation was not what it should have been, and you started a protest against the inhumane working conditions at the farm that successfully led to reforms and regulations of working conditions in the agricultural industry. And you organized the first large-scale strike held by migrant laborers in Italy. All of this at the age of 26, so chapeau. And thanks to your advocacy, the Anti-Mafia District Attorney's Office of Lecce started an investigation on the caporalato, leading to the arrest of 16 caporali. And you were the key witness in the trial. So again, chapeau. Through your continued activism, working with this CGIL, which is a big union, you finished your degree in engineering in 2015, chapeau again, and you published these two books, one on your experience in the Italian agricultural sector called Ghetto Italia, I braccianti stranieri tra caporalato e sfruttamento, which means Ghetto Italia, foreign ag workers between caporalato and exploitation, and a second book about your experience in the Masseria Boncuri. And then you were knighted Cavaliere dell'Ordine del Merito by the Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, for your work in ending or helping end modern slavery in the Italian agricultural worker. You founded NoCap, No Caporalato Association, which is a reward system working with report cards, evaluating how ethically goods have been produced through the parameters of energy, circularity, labor, and in the supply chain. And you advocate for the ethical employment of tomato pickers through regulated contracts and without a caporalato, promoting the integration of ethically produced goods in the mainstream consumer market. So very excited to have you here. Bonjour, bonsoir,
Bonsoir.
and welcome. Then we have another superstar in our midst, and I love this bi-coastal story here because it's Italy and the US. You see the Italian film directors working in the US, but remembering their home country. We have Judge Laura Saifer Espinoza, who is a retired New York State Supreme Court Justice. We don't get those very often at SAIS here, so we're very excited to have you. You were served in New York and Bronx County for 20 years, and you were Deputy Supervising Judge for 5 years in your last 5 years. You helped design and became the first presiding judge of the Bronx Treatment Court, which was an innovative alternative to incarceration for nonviolent offenders. And given the number of people we have in our prisons, this is absolutely critical. Following your very early retirement, I would say, you took a consulting job funded by the DOJ, the Department of Justice, through the Conference of Western Attorney Generals, and you ended up teaching and leading teams of teachers of trial advocacy in Latin America, all countries undergoing law reform and advising on human rights issues in general. Now, there are a number of judges and countries, especially Chile and Mexico, that really owe a lot to you and what you have, the time you dedicated to the rule of law improvement there. And during this period, you came into contact with a coalition of Immokalee workers and seemed to be impressed by what they were trying to achieve with a campaign for fair food. And you were instrumental in the subsequent launch of the Fair Food Standards Council, became their director. And you're drawing very heavily, it seems, on your judicial experience as you monitor the council's enforcement activities for all participating farms, including complaint, investigation, resolution, auditing, and implementation of corrective action plans. You're a Barnard graduate in American history and went on to get your law degree at NYU. So welcome, Judge Saifer. It's really, really thrilling to have you here. So I would say maybe we can start with Yvan. If you can do your presentation, because it flows more sort of immediately from the trailer, but I would ask you both just a quick response. What did you think of the trailer? Did you think, Yvan, do you think it was a fair, did it capture what's going on in the fields? It was Abu Bakr. I don't know if you know him, but is this documentary sort of capturing what's happening right now in Italy? Is there a translation? Est-ce que ce film vous a montré exactement ce qui se passe maintenant en Italie dans l'agro-industrie?
Disons, Abu Bakr, je le connais très bien.
In italiano.
Abu Bakr lo conosco molto bene. Questo documentario mostra una parte di quello che sta succedendo in Italia, una parte importante ovviamente, perché la questione dei ghetti è una questione molto importante.
Okay, poi sicuramente Yvan will explain in his presentation a little bit more about the other things. And Laura, just quickly, just to say, if I may call you Laura, what was your quick reaction to this trailer?
First of all, good evening and thank you. But the quick reaction is that it was very strikingly similar to conditions before the Fair Food Program launched, and also strikingly similar to conditions that are ongoing today outside the program. So yes, very moving, and the parallels were striking.
We'll talk about those later on in the Q&A, but Yvan, I would be pleased to hear from you. And if you could let us know sort of what the key issues are and what NoCap is, what you're trying to get accomplished with NoCap.
Se potete fare un po' la traduzione così.
Cos'è NoCap?
Se lei può fare la sua presentazione.
Non è
Ok, chiedo scusa.
Non c'è problema.
Ok, allora, NoCap significa no caporalato. È un'associazione fondata da me nel 2017 che nasce per contrastare il caporalato e lo sfruttamento in agricoltura. È un passaggio dalla protesta alla proposta. Perché spesso si denuncia ma non si riesce a risolvere. NoCap nasce per risolvere i problemi, non solo per raccontare i problemi, per denunciare i problemi. E NoCap ha messo in campo una modalità unica per risolvere il problema, molto complessa, che si basa su che cosa? Che si basa su un'alleanza tra i vari soggetti della filiera. NoCap mette insieme i produttori, gli agricoltori, i supermercati e i consumatori. NoCap mette insieme questi 4 soggetti della filiera che spesso non si parlano, spesso si fanno la guerra tra di loro, non si rispettano. I supermercati non rispettano gli agricoltori perché pagano poco il prodotto. Gli agricoltori a loro volta sfruttano i lavoratori perché il prodotto, essendo pagato poco, non gli consente di rispettare i diritti. Quindi si fanno la guerra tra poveri. E non
posso chiederle di lasciare adesso il traduttore?
Sì.
Okay, at the beginning, it was explained that, in fact, he said I didn't know, or I do know very well, Abu Bakr, the person in the documentary. And the documentary is very important. It shows a part, however, only of what is happening, an important part, because there are those terrible ghettos. And then with regard to what Yvan said afterwards, he said NoCap is short for no caporalato, which is no gangmaster system. And it's an association that was founded by me in 2017. And it was founded to fight against exploitation and the gangmaster system, the caporalato. And it, in fact, is an attempt, and a determined attempt, to go from protest to a specific proposal, because very often one makes claims, one revolts and denounces certain things, but actually the problems don't get solved. So NoCap, in fact, is designed to actually solve problems, not just to speak out against them. And it's based on a very complex but very unique model of association. In other words, it's an alliance between all the various people that belong to the supply chain. That is, the producers, the farmers themselves, the supermarkets, and also the consumers. So NoCap brings together these 4 players in the whole supply chain, because very often they don't speak to one another, and very often they act and fight against each other. For example, the supermarkets lower their prices, so the farmers in turn exploit their agricultural workers. So it's really a war among poor people.
Ok, Yvan può continuare ancora un po' e poi daremo possibilità alla traduttrice.
Quindi NoCap cerca di intervenire sul sistema, sul modello di sviluppo economico ultraliberista che si basa, come lo sappiamo, sulla concentrazione della ricchezza, non ridistribuisce la ricchezza all'interno della filiera agroalimentare. Io ho passato 10 anni di lotta, come dicevo prima, a denunciare e io ho capito che la repressione da solo non basta, che i caporali sono solo l'effetto, non la causa del problema. Quindi la causa è questo modello produttivo e questo modello di sviluppo. E quindi il fatto di andare a intervenire all'interno della filiera per contrastare le cause, cioè lo strapotere dei supermercati, delle multinazionali, è questo che è la base della proposta di NoCap. Una proposta...
Ok, lasciamo la traduttrice, scusi.
So NoCap in fact wants to intervene and take action on the system that we live in. In other words, this is a system which is based on economic development, which is completely free market, laissez-faire, which is based in turn on a concentration of wealth and the non-redistribution of wealth, especially in the agricultural field. I, for 10 years, worked speaking out against this system, and I've realized that, in fact, it's not enough just to try and do something legally against the system, because the gangmasters, the caporalato, are in fact an effect rather than the cause, and the cause is the actual model of economic system that we have. So we want to act and bring together all the people in the supply chain to act on the cause, which is the excessive power of the supermarkets and the multinationals.
Oh boy, that starts getting into business and human rights issues. Very interesting. Yvan, lei può continuare, grazie.
Sì, e quindi la nostra azione si basa quindi principalmente per sensibilizzare il consumatore. Guardate, il consumatore finale è quello che ha il grande potere per cambiare le cose. Sono noi cittadini, sono i 60 milioni di italiani, 500 milioni di europei, sono noi tutti cittadini che quando noi andiamo a fare la spesa per comprare un prodotto, noi dobbiamo farsi delle domande, ma questa passata di pomodoro da dove viene? Come è stato raccolto? Chi l'ha raccolto? Queste sono le domande che noi cittadini, quando noi entriamo in un supermercato, dobbiamo porsi, perché fin quando non ci faremo queste domande, con i nostri soldi che spendiamo andremo ad alimentare un sistema illegale che dà soldi alla mafia, ai caporali, agli agricoltori senza scrupoli. Per questo abbiamo fondato questo marchio, il marchio NoCap, per avere un prodotto senza caporalato, senza sfruttamento. E i ragazzi migranti italiani che hanno raccolto che hanno prodotto questo pomodoro, sono stati pagati legalmente, hanno avuto un salario dignitoso, un contratto, lavorano 6 ore e mezza, come la legge dice, non 14 ore al giorno, prendono 50 euro al giorno e non 15 euro al giorno. Tutti i diritti e la dignità viene rispettati grazie all'azione del consumatore. Questa è l'economia che vuole portare NoCap, questa è la nostra azione.
Grazie, Yvan. Okay, we'll give the translator a chance to talk about this very important message on consumer activism.
Yes, in fact, our action is to raise awareness among consumers, because it's the end consumer, in fact, that has power in his or her hands. In Italy, we have 60 million people, and we have 500 million people in Europe. So we must raise awareness that when people go to buy something, or as we all do, go and buy food, we have to ask, well, this particular canned tomatoes, where does it come from? How is it harvested? Who harvested it? And we have to, in fact, get people to ask those questions. And that, in fact, otherwise, the money that we pay for the food in our supermarkets will only go to fuel and to feed a system, which in turn feeds the mafia, feeds the gangmaster system, and also the rich farmers. And so we have developed this sticker, or this label, NoCap, and it is intended to wipe out the gangmaster system and exploitation, both of Italian and foreign migrant laborers. If you see a sticker, NoCap sticker or label, that means that it has been produced legally, that the people who actually harvested it, worked on it, have a regular contract. They work 6.5 hours a day, not 14 hours as before, and they get paid 50 euros and not the 15 euros per day that they would have got under the gangmaster system. So it is in fact action directed to the consumer, and it's thanks to the consumer that we're able to do this.
Thank you very much. I think now we will we'll have a chance to come back to Yvan with questions, but I'd like to pass the floor now to Laura Espinoza, who interestingly enough has also, that the US and your group has also come up with market-based solutions to this intractable issue. So Laura, if you could share with us your experience in Florida and with the immokalee workers.
Absolutely, thank you. And yes, as I said earlier, the similarities are truly remarkable, and the analysis as well. So it is a pleasure, and thank you, Yvan, for your presentation. Well, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you, and really a privilege to learn more about the situation and the inspiring struggle of migrant workers in Italy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as Nina said in the beginning, we have truly seen the fault lines in our society exposed, and a deepening of hardships that are caused by fundamental inequalities. In the case of agricultural workers, designation as essential workers, as they were in the US, has not stopped the treatment of their lives as expendable. In the US, legislation addressing the high level of risk faced by these workers during the pandemic exists only in a handful of states, and little to no provision has been made to ensure any kind of consistent access to protective equipment, testing, and quarantine facilities. Then, when the inevitable high rates of infection in farm worker communities result, many politicians simply scapegoat the victims in both racist and xenophobic public statements. But this type of marginalization is not new. One short decade ago, the area of Southwest Florida that gave birth to the Fair Food Program was known by federal prosecutors as ground zero for modern day slavery. In fact, since the times of chattel slavery, there's been an unbroken thread of exploitation, including cases of forced labor in US agriculture. And this was true whether the workers were African Americans, subject to debt peonage or the convict lease program, or in more recent decades, vulnerable immigrant workers. Additionally, legislative exclusions on race-based in origin have always denied farm workers important legal protections, including freedom of association. And those protections that do exist are rarely enforced. The founders of the Fair Food Program are members of a community-based organization called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW. They are largely immigrant workers from Mexico, Guatemala, and Haiti. The organization didn't set out to combat human trafficking, but rather they were looking to put an end to abuses, including violence, sexual assault, systemic wage theft, and exposure to dangerous conditions that were all part of farm workers' daily experience. As they organized, however, inevitably at the far end of that spectrum of degraded working conditions, CIW found cases of modern day slavery, cases in which workers, sometimes hundreds at a time, in operations spanning several states, were held against their will, kept in isolation and debt, and subjected to violence, intimidation, and coercion. In response, CIW members pioneered a victim-centered approach to slavery investigations and prosecutions. Their successful collaboration with the Department of Justice resulted in the liberation of over 1,200 workers throughout the southern US, and with another case breaking outside the Fair Food Program as we speak. Members went undercover, and I'm sure they would have a lot to talk about with Yvan when they hopefully meet someday. In 2015, CIW was awarded a presidential medal for its efforts that were key in sparking the anti-trafficking movement in the US. But as with our Italian colleagues, the goal was not to keep uncovering cases. Rather, coalition members imagined workplaces without victims, and they sought to eliminate underlying conditions that allowed those abuses to take root in the first place. Initially, they found that work stoppages and other traditional forms of advocacy brought very limited success. And because responsibility in criminal prosecutions always stopped at the level of the labor contractor, similar to the figure that Yvan described, despite long prison terms achieved for many such contractors, agricultural companies that employed them had little incentive to fundamentally change their practices. So eventually, coalition members realized that a different model to create transformative change might be possible, and that the top of the food supply chain, large retail purchasers of produce, like fast food chains, food service companies, and supermarkets, actually held the market power to affect change at the level of their supplier farms. And their analysis was the same as the one set out in The Invisibles, or the one that Yvan just laid out on the struggle in Italy. That is, that the downward pressure exerted by those companies on their suppliers was responsible for the misery of workers at the bottom of the supply chain. And so in 2001, through what became known as the Campaign for Fair Food, farm workers living in the isolated edge of the Florida Everglades reached out to consumers of conscience across the country. They sought to harness market power to reverse that pressure and use it as a force to correct injustice. And it was that alliance between workers and consumers that eventually accumulated enough market power to launch the Fair Food Program in 2011. Today, 14 major food retailers have signed legally binding Fair Food Program agreements with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Now, buyers commit to purchase only from growers who implement a human rights-based code of conduct with zero tolerance provisions for forced labor, child labor, sexual assault, and other forms of violence, as well as a range of comprehensive workplace protections. They also pay a premium, initially known as the penny per pound, that is passed through to workers as a bonus to supplement their wages. For their part, participating growers commit to implement the code, whose protections extend to workers without discrimination of any kind, and to cooperate with the organization designated by the coalition to monitor and enforce compliance, which I have the privilege of directing. And we can say that in a few short years of implementation, this market-based model, as Yvan predicts, reached a level of prevention of the worst of abuses. Faced with a choice between retaining bad actors and practices or losing eligibility to sell to some of the world's largest food retailers, growers have always made the right decision. That includes their commitment to the program's direct hire requirement, which together with other code provisions such as progressive discipline, prohibiting retaliation, broke the power traditionally held by those labor contractors. And in the case of guest workers, growers commit to only use the FFP's designated channel for recruitment, a channel that is continually vetted against corruption. And most recently, the only mandatory privately enforceable COVID-19 related protocols for agricultural workers in the US are being implemented on Fair Food Program farms. We're happy to be able to report remarkably low rates of infection among workers on Fair Food Program farms as a result. And for the last couple of minutes, I just want to leave you with a couple of questions here. So to understand the Fair Food Program, you have only to ask yourself, what would a social responsibility program look like if workers could design it? Well, the program's code is not generic, but specific to the industry and based on the experience and priorities of workers themselves. Then there would be effective education that is as deep and widespread as possible. Workers at Fair Food Program farms receive education on their rights under the program at the point of hire, in addition to worker-to-worker education sessions on all Fair Food Program farms. Next, there is monitoring that provides a continuous flow of credible information. Worker education has created thousands of worker monitors who actively enforce their own rights in the workplace through their interactions with supervisors and coworkers every day, as well as with the Fair Food Standards Council. The council is a separate nonprofit whose investigators carry out comprehensive audits that far exceed standard corporate responsibility program access and procedures. Most critical to success, however, is the program's 24/7 complaint hotline that is always answered live by the same investigators who are familiar with the situations that give rise to workers' concerns. In expedited procedures, over 50% of complaints are resolved within 2 weeks and 80% within 1 month. Finally, you would have an enforcement mechanism that is prompt, powerful, and certain. And as you heard, behind the code and its monitoring results stand the market consequences of the program's participating buyers. If growers fail to comply, they simply can't sell to the program's participating growers. And what we have as a result, last thought, is a win-win-win situation. Buyers benefit from transparency and elimination of supply chain risk at a time when you, as consumers, increasingly demand to know the conditions under which your goods are produced. Participating growers receive purchasing preference and they become employers of choice. For workers, the changes are comprehensive and dramatic. After generations of abuse, the worst practices and actors are being eliminated, and even during COVID-19, workers are able to enforce their rights free of retaliation. The program has now expanded to multiple states and crops, most recently adding the cut flour industry. And the elements of its worker-driven social responsibility program have been or are in the process of being adapted by workers in diverse supply chains, ranging from dairy and construction to garment, poultry, and even fashion and entertainment. So I'll leave it there. I know that was a mouthful, but thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, I feel like I want to, there are so many elements that are similar, right? And clearly one of the big themes here is that we need to find market-based solutions to this phenomenon. I think Yvan made that very clear, and that's why he started NoCap, and that's why you've been so involved with the Fair Food Program and what you all have managed to achieve, because the fact that it's now moving and it's a best practice for many other industries in ag and others, but moving to other states is phenomenal. And everyone around the world looks at this model. I had a couple of questions coming in, so I will ask you, Laura, and then I will ask Yvan. All from, I would say, someone in the know, who is Richa Mital, who works for the Fair Labor Association, who had some very specific questions for both of you. One, do the buyers in the Fair Food Program have to buy 100% of the commodity? Or is there only a minimum percentage to be in the Fair Food Program? That is a very specific question.
When they are buying from the regions where the Fair Food Program has been implemented, they must buy from Fair Food Program growers, and 100% from Fair Food Program growers. And if they cannot fill the demand, which is not the case ever in Florida, because the Fair Food, 90% of tomato production has now joined the Fair Food Program. So participating buyers must buy exclusively from those growers. It doesn't mean any one grower, they don't have to buy a specific amount from any one grower, but they must buy from Fair Food Program growers. And part of Paul's job, who is, was so kind to assist me with the slides here, is that we monitor those purchases and in monthly reports, both from buyers and growers. And that tracks the premium as well that is paid by the participating buyers. So we have a very good check on being able to monitor those purchases.
So linked to that premium question also still from Richa Mitalis, and I think a lot of people are asking this, both for you and Yvan, what is the premium for consumers? Are these fruit and vegetables more expensive, or are they competitive with sort of other produce which does not have these kind of stringent oversight?
There has not been, there has not been any significant raise in the price to consumers by these growers. The fluctuation in tomato price has so many factors, and consumers are used to wild swings depending on weather, depending on what happened to the season, depending on blight. It is a wild range of prices. And so one can imagine they have passed along the penny per pound to the consumer, but it is not something that the participating buyers report any issue in, in marketing this produce as opposed to other.
Interesting, because most people would say, well, it'll make it much more expensive. Yvan, sì, la domanda era, è più caro se con NoCap o con la possibilità di sapere quello che succede nella catena agricola, se il prezzo per i pomodori e per altre frutta e verdura è più cara, se siete pagati dignitosamente?
Sì, allora i nostri prodotti come costo si avvicinano a quelli tradizionali, perché noi abbiamo fatto un'operazione di introdurre altri 5 parametri che vanno a ridurre il costo della produzione. Sapete, quando la filiera è molto lunga, il costo diventa insostenibile. Cioè, i prezzi oggi sono determinati anche dal fatto che un prodotto dalla raccolta fino al consumatore fa tantissimi passaggi. Noi abbiamo introdotto un meccanismo che si chiama la filiera corta, il cosiddetto chilometro zero. Quindi il nostro prodotto fa un solo passaggio per arrivare al supermercato, non fa più 3-4 come in Italia, e questo riduce i costi. Il trasporto, per esempio, non c'è più tanti viaggi, c'è solo un viaggio, uno. Poi stiamo lavorando molto per sostenere le energie rinnovabili. Le energie rinnovabili per noi sono molto importanti. I nostri sistemi, le nostre aziende si stanno convertendo verso l'uso delle energie rinnovabili, a partire per esempio dai pannelli solari, e questo gli consente di abbassare i costi di produzione. Sapete che l'energia rappresenta circa il 20% del costo per produrre un prodotto. Quindi con l'introduzione per esempio dell'energia, le nostre aziende non consumano più l'energia dello Stato, ma usano i pannelli privati che li abbassano i costi da almeno del 18%. Quindi sono tutta una serie di parametri che fanno sì che poi il costo si avvicina di molto a quello normale.
Grazie, grazie. Adesso lasciamo al traduttore.
In fact, that we have for our produce is very close to the traditional price on normal market shelves. This is because we have introduced a very special operation with 5 parameters in order to lower the cost of production of the produce. Because if you have and which is very often the case, if you have a very long supply chain, then the prices go up and the price becomes untenable. And you know that the price, in fact, depends on how many passages there are from harvest to the consumer. And what we have done is shorten the length of time, or shorten the supply chain, going to something that is called kilometro zero, 0 kilometers, or the short supply train. And in our case, we just have 1 passage, not the 3 or 4 that usually takes place for an Italian product. For example, with transport, there's just 1 trip, 1 voyage that is taken from the actual place of production to where it's sold. And then we're doing a lot with regard to pushing renewable energy, because that, of course, will reduce the price. Our farmers are converting to getting energy from solar panels, which of course is highly, which reduces the price, because energy of course is a very large component, about 20% of the cost of the product. So by introducing solar panels, the companies no longer use energy from the state, but use their own private energy system, and they can reduce the cost by about 18%. So we're using a whole series of parameters to keep that price of the product close to the original traditional price.
Laura,
Just one more thing, just for people, you know, there have been numerous surveys taken of consumers but in the US, and the result is always that people would, in the event that it was someday more expensive, like let's say Yvan's group is able to cover all of Italy and it eventually becomes a few cents more for product, people have shown their willingness over and over to, when they can identify good practices, to also pay for them. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix. It has not been a huge factor in the Fair Food Program. No, it doesn't sound like it has been for Yvan either, but should it someday become a factor, I think most households would be willing to pay a few cents more for ethical produce.
And I think as millennials and our students become bigger and bigger consumers, they do care, and they will, you know, they will pay a penny or two more. It can't be much more expensive. But it would be interesting to know, because it seems clear that there are so many factors in this supply chain, that the cost to workers and the worker wages is a very small cost. And I don't know if either of you would know what the percentage is in the supply chain due to all the other factors. Is that something you would know, Laura?
Sorry, it has varied from crop to crop and season to season, but it is, the studies that I have seen say it ranges somewhere between 2 to 4 or 5% of the cost of produce.
2 to 4 or 5% of the entire cost.
Correct.
Wow. Okay. I think that's a surprise. That would be a surprise to everybody. And that puts everything into perspective, because one can certainly do a lot more in terms of providing a minimum wage and dignity in work if it's so little, and increasing a little bit more can make a big difference. I have another number of questions that have come in from a business and human rights expert, a Columbia PhD postdoc fellow, Antonella Angelini, who is asking, had some questions on whether the NoCap label is based on certification and who does it. Questo per Yvan. Se avete dei siete certificati da terzi o siete voi che fate la certificazione, e se ci sono problemi fra gli agricoltori, c'è un modo di fare il reporting per risolverli. Again, these are whether there's whether that's the third-party audits for the NoCap certification, and what kind of grievance mechanism do they have. Yvan.
Sì, noi abbiamo un ente terzo che ci certifica, si chiama il DIQUA, che sarebbe il Dipartimento Qualità Agroalimentare, l'ente nostro. Però io non credo molto alle certificazioni, alle enti di certificazione. Non lo dico perché non è importante, ma perché in questi 40 anni tutte le inchieste, per esempio prendo gli ultimi 5 anni, sono state 3.000 aziende agricole sequestrate. Di queste 3.000 aziende agricole sequestrate, il 90% hanno delle certificazioni internazionali anche di altissimo prestigio. Quindi 90% delle aziende che usano i caporali in Italia, lo sfruttamento, hanno quasi tutte le certificazioni. E quindi mi pongo la domanda, ma a cosa quindi serve la certificazione? NoCap non è un ente di certificazione, noi siamo come dicevo, una rete. Noi interveniamo sulla filiera per portare sostenibilità economica alle aziende e poi sostenibilità sociale ai lavoratori. Noi siamo noi a dare la casa alle persone, siamo noi a dare i mezzi di trasporto, perché da noi il caporalato, lo sfruttamento si basa sul trasporto dei lavoratori, dalle loro case, dai ghetti, come avete visto nel video, verso i luoghi di lavoro. Quindi NoCap mette a disposizione con i suoi propri mezzi che otteniamo grazie alle campagne di crowdfunding, donazione, eccetera, per comprare i bus Yvan per i lavoratori. Quindi la nostra filiera è molto sicura perché diamo non solo sostegno sociale, casa, alloggio, contratti di lavoro. Noi andiamo nei ghetti a prendere le persone, cioè la nostra forza è che i nostri attivisti vanno all'interno di questi ghetti che vi avete visto nel video, prendiamo le persone. Abbiamo preso 400 persone quest'anno all'interno dei ghetti e gli abbiamo dato casa, trasporto, contratto. Quindi non c'è modo di avere lo sfruttamento all'interno della nostra filiera.
Grazie, grazie. We'll leave the translator do her wonderful job.
Chiedo scusa.
No, è molto brava, quindi avanti.
We don't have a certification system, in fact. We are certified, and there is a certification body, which is a state body. But quite frankly, I don't really believe in these certification bodies, whoever they are. And I don't say that because I don't think it's important. Certification is important. But in all the inquiries that have been made, and 3,000 of these companies were in fact seized or put under some sort of restraint, 90% of these companies that weren't above board all had, and very often, prestigious certification to show for what they were doing. But these were companies that nonetheless were working with the gangmaster system, with a caporalato, but they were all certified. So one can ask, in that situation, what use is certification? So we, as NoCap, are not a certification body. We are a network that help people, and especially help the companies, but help the workers. We give them a home, and also we supply transport to the place of work, because that is how the gangmasters actually use their influence and have their power with the transport system. But we come in and we give them a home, and we take them to the fields. As NoCap, in fact, we were able to get these vans to be able to transport people through a program and through help. So we, if you like, look after the supply train fully, and therefore it's a system which is very secure, very safe, because it is directed by us. We give people homes. Those ghettos that you saw in that film, we have been to them. We've taken 400 people from them, and we've given them a home. We've given them the possibility to have transport and also a above board contract. So that's how we work as a network.
Thank you very much. A number of questions coming in from people I recognize, which is wonderful. Other business and human rights professors, I'll say Professor Elizabeth Umlas, who wants to know about the Fair Food Program as you expand. How do you envision handling and monitoring the enforcement in an increasingly geographical area and number of crops? I mean, if you also, plus if you, hopefully one day you will be able to include California, which is the other huge state, agricultural state, how do you plan to do that? And another question related to what you're doing is what's keeping the other 10% of the farms in Immokalee from joining the Fair Food Program? What is their problem?
Well, great questions. Thank you. The first question on the geographic regions is what we do contemplate, and funny you should ask, we are in conversations with growers right now and the motivating buyers, because let's speak a very firm truth here. It is the the few and far between, it's your unicorn grower who is going to come into this unless they are brought to the table by a buyer, motivated by sales. They're not going to do it, although after they join, they all say they're doing the right thing for the right reasons. That is just almost never the case. And so it is always motivated by the buyers. And we are in conversations right now with growers in 2 different states, and one of them includes California. And it is quite simple. I mean, what we would envision ultimately is having satellite offices. We almost had to do that when we expanded up the East Coast, and we're now, you know, in 7 additional states. But because the seasons don't overlap, you know, the harvest moves north, we are able to do it with the same staff, but we will not be able to do that in some regions like California where the seasons don't overlap. So we will definitely open satellite offices there. There will be similar Fair Food Standards Council setup with both the auditing and the complaint resolution mechanism, because I do agree with Yvan that most certification schemes are basically not worth the paper they're written on, because if you don't have both the education, the auditing, the complaint resolution, and the market consequences behind it, you have people parachuting in and certifying and leaving. And as he eloquently said, the disaster remains right behind them. The other question was, what about the 10%? Well, that's a great question too. And the answer also lies with the buyers and the consuming public, because the day that the buyers say, all buyers say, we have some very powerful buyers, but there are only 14 of them. There's still a big market out there. They can sell in our area. There's a huge supermarket chain, Publix. They have not joined.
Terrible.
They have not joined. Kroger's hasn't joined. So the day that their markets get shut off, they will join. But until that time, there's always a drive to the bottom. And the slavery cases are continuing. See, we do that work outside the Fair Food Program. There's a case that just went to indictment last week. So that all will continue. It's not that they see the light one day, it's their market needs to be shut off. And the boycotts help to do that, but you can only boycott so many targets at one time. You know, the consumer pressure is not easy to muster in an organized campaign.
Thank you very much. Well, let's talk about government oversight, shall we? And I will follow up first with you, and then I'll ask Yvan the situation of sort of what is the role of government here, and you know, what kind of oversight is there in the fields? Are there prosecutions happening? And in the US, and I had to look this up because I'm all over factory labor legislation with OSHA, which for those in Italy who may not know is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration under the Department of Labor. What are the regulations on the books for oversight of these labor practices in the US? Is there follow-up if there's mistreatment of farm workers? If you were not to report it, what would be really happening here?
Such a good question. Such a sad answer. You know, obviously forced labor is illegal. Obviously wage theft is illegal. Pesticide poisoning is illegal. Rape is illegal. But you have vulnerable populations, and they are not protected against retaliation in most workplaces. And the Department of Labor, you know, it is underfunded. There's about 1 inspector for every 250,000 workers. And the laws protecting agricultural workers are reprehensibly slim. And even the ones that do exist, the enforcement is very it's not systemic and it's not deep, and growers will pay fines. They will definitely pay fines. Somebody asked, you know, why doesn't criminal sanctions deter? They pay fines like as if it's just another cost of business for them. And they do not, the criminal responsibility ends at the level of the caporalato. Like here it is the labor contractor. It ends there. So the agricultural companies continue to operate with impunity. And there are very good, well-meaning, you know, we work with DOL all the time. We work with the FBI. We work with Homeland Security in the trafficking cases, and we have good relationships. We do trainings with them, in fact, you know, on victim-centered ways to do these prosecutions, and oftentimes people end up with immigration relief and other benefits. But approaching it on a systemic level is not what happens through government enforcement here, at least here. It doesn't. That is why the Fair Food the coalition imagined this scheme that would be systemic, where the consequence for forced labor, and I don't know if there are, you know, lawyers in the audience who get that this distinction is really key, that we don't have to prove that the grower knew, that the grower intended, that the grower should have known. If there is forced labor on their premises, they cannot sell for a period of time. They are suspended for an entire season the first time and much longer the second time. And so amazingly, the bad actors disappeared from their operations, because once it was going to be very not profitable to have those people in there, those perpetrators of forced labor, everybody knew who they were. It's not a big secret. And so they just got them gone, you know, and the labor, and I mentioned it very quickly in passing, but the growers must employ people directly. And that is huge too, because that just chops the knees out of the power of the labor contractor. They are no longer direct employers, but there's no tools that the government has that can eke into that power relationship. They review their licenses, they make sure they have the right insurance and this and that, but they're not on the ground talking to people, and people are not trusting them. Have you ever tried calling a government agency and going through all the voicemail and everything like that? If you're not, especially if you're not English speaking, it's very difficult, very, very difficult.
Thank you, Laura. Pretty depressing. Yes, I think you gave us some, hopefully in this new administration, there'll be a little bit more oversight on these essential workers.
Don't get me wrong, we do cooperate. Once we have built the cases, we do bring them to them. And without the government, agents of goodwill, we would not be able to prosecute them. We have definitely had good experiences that way, but not with them being the ones to surface those cases.
Yvan, domanda di nuovo sul ruolo del governo, dato che quello che succede sono contravversione di varie leggi, quindi cioè, è un crimine quello che sta succedendo, soprattutto il caporalato. Se avete con i carabinieri, per esempio, potete lavorare e portare, come lei ha portato, molti di questi caporali sono stati arrestati. Come vede il modo di operare e quello che può fare il governo magari per aiutarvi? Certo, aggiungo che il fatto che non siete documentati è un grave problema in questo senso, ma lei vede che c'è progresso, nel senso che il governo è più attento?
Allora, diciamo che il governo è poco attento. poco attento. L'Italia, come lo sapete, è una porta d'ingresso nell'Europa per tantissimi migranti che vengono dall'Africa e dall'Asia. Entrano in Italia e le leggi sull'immigrazione del governo italiano, soprattutto la legge Bossi-Fini, prima ancora del governo Berlusconi, poi i decreti sicurezza di Salvini, di Matteo Salvini, leader di estrema destra, hanno peggiorato la situazione dei migranti e quelle leggi li rendono vulnerabili nei confronti della mafia e dei caporali e di chi li sfrutta.
Ok,
quindi,
lasciamo tradurre perché è roba molto importante, grazie.
Well, let's say that the Italian government is not very attentive to this. Italy, as you know, is the entrance port into the whole of the rest of Europe of many, many immigrants coming from Africa, coming from Asia. They're trying to come into Europe through Italy. And there have been several laws. So first of all, the law under the Berlusconi government called the Bossi-Fini law. And then after that, there was a decree law, like an executive order on the part of Salvini, who is an extreme right-wing politician. And these laws, in fact, made the immigrants extremely vulnerable, vulnerable especially to the mafia and to the gangmaster, the caporalato system.
Ok, Yvan, può procedere, scusi.
Sì, quindi c'è un problema di leggi in Italia sull'immigrazione che non favoriscono l'emersione al lavoro, contro il lavoro nero. Poi dall'altra parte non c'è tanta corruzione in Italia e poi questi politici e istituzioni che dovrebbero spesso controllare che le persone non vengano sfruttate, molti sono corrotti. Gli agricoltori, per esempio, italiani, avendo tanti soldi, spesso sono loro che fanno le campagne elettorali, finanziano le campagne elettorali di questi politici, quindi che chiudono gli occhi a livello locale. E quindi e poi dall'altra parte il fatto che i centri per l'impiego non funzionano più. In Italia non c'è più un sistema vero, legale, di incontro fra la domanda e l'offerta di lavoro. Oggi è il caporalato che ha sostituito i centri per l'impiego, i centri proposti. E i datori di lavoro italiano, quando ha bisogno di 50 persone, 100 persone, non è che va al centro per l'impiego, ma chiama i caporali. Quindi se non c'è una riforma dei centri per l'impiego, ci sarà sempre il caporalato. La stessa cosa sulle ispezioni, sui controlli. Ci sono pochi controlli in Italia, quindi anche qui serve una riforma dell'ispettorato del lavoro. Poi a livello europeo, importante, l'agricoltura italiana, come tutta l'agricoltura europea, viene sovvenzionato con dei fondi importanti. C'è un sistema di finanziamento che si chiama la PAC, la Politica Agricola Comunitaria, che si è chiusa ultimamente e rappresenta il 40% del budget dell'Unione Europea che va all'agricoltura, e noi chiediamo una cosa molto semplice, che i soldi che l'Unione Europea dà ai governi dei paesi europei, in particolare ai governi italiani, per sostenere gli agricoltori, quei soldi devono andare a quegli agricoltori che rispettano i diritti dei lavoratori. Questo è una cosa molto semplice.
Punto molto importante. I want to make sure everyone gets that. Okay, we'll let our wonderful translator capture that.
Okay. In fact, in Italy, the laws favor rather than try and discourage illegal work. That's the situation in Italy. And then there's another point. There's an awful lot of corruption in Italy. Politicians and the institutions who should, in fact, be supervising, control the situation, very often are corrupt, and that sort of control and supervision is not carried out. And then there's another fact, again, the growers themselves are very rich, and they often finance the political campaigns of the local politician. who then in turn closes his eyes to this situation. And then also there's another question. The job exchanges, the employment centers in Italy have stopped functioning and they don't work. There's no legal way of bringing together the demand and supply for on the labor market in Italy. So what happens is that growers in the agricultural sector just go to the gangmaster, to the caporale, to to get labor if they need workers. If they need 50 or 100 people, they just call the caporale, the gangmaster, and he goes out and finds it. So we need, in fact, an exchange reform of these job centers or job exchange centers. And then also the same thing applies to the controls, the supervision, which is practically non-existent. There are very few of them. Therefore, we need a reform in what's called the inspection of labor. And this also applies to the rest of Europe. Europe, in fact, funds farming to a very large extent, European farming and Italian farming, with subsidies under the CAP, the Community Agricultural Project or policy. And in fact, 40% of the budget of the EU goes to farming subsidies to help farmers. And therefore, we would ask that the money that is given to the government, the Italian government, for farming should be given to only to those growers that abide by and enforce the rules.
Oh, that is a massive point, a little bit like what's happening here with subsidies toward small, medium-sized enterprises and larger under COVID. So yes, for the energy transition, we need to think about the ethical implications of the transition as well as the green. That's what we're doing in this transition. And the point that Yvan made about help to farmers is very on point. I want to fold in a question that Bianca Getzel has asked, and we're going to have to wrap it up soon. She's an MA candidate in international political economy, and so she's focusing on labor market policy. And her mother works in Lecce, so this is particularly poignant for her. And she was asking about sort of how we're going to get at this from trade imbalances and how we can pressure the agricultural market to press the agricultural companies to not have so much downward pressure on the costs. And I wanted to fold that into a question that I meant to ask Laura and Yvan in closing, is there is an upcoming European directive that will be focusing on big retailers, on all private sector, so all companies that must do due diligence on the human rights and environmental problems in their supply chain. And that is a requirement that is going to may have civil and criminal consequences if they don't report and they don't do it well. We can expect this in about a year, but I am wondering, at least for Europe, whether this is a beginning of sort of getting at the market pressures and getting at the supermarket and retail chains in a way to force transparency so that consumers can make a pressure as well as investors. I will ask first Laura and then Yvan, even though this is not for the US, but hopefully some kind of similar copycat legislation will come into force at some point in a late Biden administration.
Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts. And I did, read the outline of the legislation, but of course the devil's always in the details. And what I can say is, of course, transparency, it's always a good value, something to be strived for. The more educated the consumer is, the better. But I will say that, as I believe Yvan was alluding to, not only the supermarkets and the suppliers have proven themselves to be very adept at passing certification, at showing that they've done XYZ, at the check the box, or we had such and such an auditing company come in and they say everything is great. The question is, what is happening on the ground? How do they know? Who is there at the worker level, at the farm level, to make sure that workers are educated on their rights, that there is monitoring, that they have a complaint resolution mechanism that functions without retaliation, and that there are real market consequences behind that? Because otherwise, I fear that it will just be another exercise in paperwork that these corporations have proven themselves very adept at handling. I hope that's not the case. And I don't know enough. I would be, you know, it would be wrong of me to opine because I don't know enough about it. But I have seen similar things, you know, yeah.
Thank you for that. And it is still early days, but people in the business and human rights community are fighting for something with a little bit more bite. And I think criminal and civil and criminal liability for companies at the top CEO level and board could have some interesting, may get them to see the light on how important this is. Yvan, domanda era su questa legge europea. Non so se lei ha sentito parlare del fatto che forse cioè, ci sarà più pressione sulle aziende di fare un reporting su tutta la catena di valore e ovviamente per i supermercati, i grandi gruppi dovranno fare il reporting proprio su tutto quello che succede nei diritti umani nella catena di valore. E se lei pensa che questo potrebbe essere un aiuto nel futuro, perché l'idea sarebbe in ogni paese che ci sarebbero delle leggi proprio civili e criminali, cioè penali sui amministratori delegati i più alti livelli delle aziende per fargli capire che devono fare qualcosa e questo ci darà molta più trasparenza in tutta la catena, inclusiva quelli dei lavoratori. Cosa ne pensa? Pensa che può essere utile una legge così?
Potrebbe essere un passo in avanti, una legge di questo tipo, anche perché noi la stiamo chiedendo in Italia da anni, una legge sulla certificazione etica. E vedete, in Italia c'è una legge sulla certificazione biologica, prodotti biologici, ma non c'è una legge sulla certificazione etica, che sono due cose diverse. Spesso il consumatore pensa che un prodotto biologico è un prodotto che è anche etico, che non è vero. Un prodotto può essere biologico, ma non è etico. Hanno fatto la legge a livello italiano sul biologico, anche a livello europeo c'è la legge sul biologico, ma non c'è al mondo, in Italia e in Unione Europea, in tutto il mondo, una legge sulla certificazione etica. Quindi serve. Tutte le certificazioni etiche che ci sono private, ma non per legge. Quindi serve, questa è la prima cosa.
Molto buono, sì. Facciamo tradurre.
Okay.
That would be a step forward if we were to have a law like this. And we've been asking for years that there be a certification, ethical certification. In Italy, there is a law on organic produce and the certification of organic produce, but we don't have a law on ethical certification. And the two things are very different, being a product being organic and a product being ethical. Very often consumers, in fact, think that because they buy an organic produce, it's necessarily ethical, but that's not the case at all. There isn't a law in Italy or in Europe on ethical certification. There are private certifications of ethical standards, but there's not a state law.
Yvan voleva continuare, poi dobbiamo chiudere qualcosa di rapido, sì.
Sì, ok. Poi serve una legge contro le pratiche sleali dei supermercati. C'è una legge che è ferma nel Parlamento italiano e speriamo che venga approvata subito. Cioè noi chiediamo che ci sia un prezzo minimo sotto il quale un supermercato non può comprare un prezzo, perché se tu compri il chilo di pomodoro a 9 centesimi o di arance, come ora, di mandarine e clementine, a 6 centesimi, l'agricoltore non ce la farà mai. Quindi una legge europea sui prezzi minimi dei prodotti che poi devono essere riportate nell'etichetta. Noi chiamiamo questo l'etichetta narrante. L'etichetta narrante è un'etichetta nel quale viene riportato il prezzo che il supermercato ha comprato all'agricoltore, poi deve anche essere riportato nell'etichetta l'origine del prodotto. L'origine del prodotto è molto importante perché cosa fanno molte grandi compagnie italiane? Comprano il pomodoro dalla Cina, non si sa come vengono trattati i lavoratori in Cina, per dire, e lo trasformano in Italia, ok? E dicono che è un pomodoro che viene dall'Italia, perché hanno fatto la trasformazione in Italia.
Allora
invece,
la trasparenza è fondamentale.
Esatto, quindi la trasparenza dell'etichetta è importante, mettere queste informazioni, il prezzo, l'origine del prodotto, perché è molto importante questo per il consumatore, così il consumatore può scegliere.
Ok, diamo alla nostra traduttrice e chiudiamo.
Okay, what we need also is a law on unfair practices. There has been a law, and the law is going through the pipeline in Parliament. Hopefully it will one day get passed, but we need this sort of law on unfair practices because the supermarkets, in fact, pressurize the growers, and the prices are very low because if, in fact, as you can see, tomatoes are sold at 9 cents a kilo and oranges, those mandarins, now at 6 cents, obviously the grower can't make headway and can't make ends meet. So we need a law which establishes a minimum price for products, and this should be put on a label, a label that we call a narrative label, a storytelling label, which would show the price at which the supermarket bought from the buyer or the grower and the origin of the product. And that's another important thing, because very many companies in Italy, they buy tomatoes, for example, from China, and there again we don't know how the Chinese laborers are actually treated, but then they process those tomatoes in Italy, and then they call it Italian tomatoes because, of course, it's been processed here. So we need a law on transparency which appears in the label, the price, the origin of the project, which will tell the consumer the story of the product.
Thank you very much. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up here. I want to thank our two speakers because they were absolutely extraordinary. Grazie mille, Yvan. Thank you so much, Laura. As you've heard, there's so much more to do on both sides of the Atlantic and in other countries where ag workers are marginalized and invisible, as the trailer of this documentary suggests. And I really hope that this webinar series helps make the invisibles visible, and that all of you help put pressure in any way you can as consumers of conscience, lawyers, citizen activists, investors, to honor the people who put fresh food on your table and to help them live in dignity, unafraid of the caporali, the middlemen, and on a path toward legalization. So without further ado, I thank you. I want to thank the translator who did an amazing job, and I pass the closure to Sara.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm just going to thank you all once again, because this was extremely interesting, and I think our audience enjoyed and learned a lot tonight. So I'm going to close this event, and I hope to see you all back on December the 14th for the next webinar part of the series. So thank you again.
Grazie a tutti. Thank you for our wonderful questions. Bravi.
Stay safe.
Stay safe. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Grazie a voi. Grazie
Yvan. È stato un onore. Veramente. Grazie.
Am I stopping the recording?
Sara,